Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us this evening for our exciting author conversation presented by the Central Arkansas Library System and the Six Bridges Book Festival. My name is Wyndham Wyeth, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we start, I would like to mention that our talk will be followed with an opportunity for you viewers at home to ask some questions. So please drop those in the chat as we go along, and we'll get to them at the end. Now, it's an honor for me to introduce you all to tonight's guest, internationally best-selling author, Tom Rob Smith. Just a little about our author. Mr. Smith's 2008 debut novel, the Soviet-era set thriller Child 44, was a smash hit and a critical success that racked up accolades along the way, such as the International Thriller Writer Award for Best First Novel, the Galaxy Book Award for Best New Writer, and the CWA Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award. The author followed his debut with two more novels, expanding the Child 44 story into a trilogy. With this fourth novel, The Farm, Smith presented readers with a gripping and unsettling exploration of psychosis, family, and the nature of truth, inspired by experiences from the author's own life. But Mr. Smith's writing credits are not limited to the printed page alone. He's responsible for developing the BBC Two series London Spy, as well as FX's American crime story, The Assassination of Gianni Versace, the latter of which won several awards, including a Golden Globe and an Emmy for Best Limited Series. And Mr. Smith himself also won a Writers Guild Award for his script for the series. The Smith's brand new novel, Cold People, which we're going to be discussing mostly today, you can pick it up at Wordsworth Books here in Little Rock. And the novel follows humanity's struggle for survival after the arrival of a powerful alien armada that forces the human race to relocate to one of the harshest environments on the planet, Antarctica. It's a fascinating and thrilling read, and I can't wait to discuss it with the author himself, Mr. Tom Rob Smith. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed this novel. It was such a fun read. I was talking to our tech person before we got on, and this past week, just about everybody in my family but me came down with strep throat. So it's been kind of hectic around here, and but getting to read this novel was a welcome escape for me from all that. So thank you for that. So diving right in, Cold People is a slight departure from your previous work in the sense that it ventures into the realm of science fiction. So I think that might be a good place for us to start. What prompted you to go into that direction with this novel?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved science fiction. I loved it growing up, both more actually cinematic. I didn't get into reading science fiction. There's a kind of bias against it, I think, academic at school. So I didn't get into reading it until maybe a bit later in my 20s, like the famous Isaac Asimov, Philip K. Dick books. But I loved it. I loved the Zemeckis, Spielberg, George Lucas worlds. And that kind of was one of my first pulls into storytelling. And it just never occurred to me that I could write that, I think. And then lockdown happened in particular. And it's interesting that you used the word escape in that introduction, because I really wanted to write a book that was a escape from everything. You didn't have to think about contemporary issues, particularly, even though obviously all books are about contemporary issues in some ways, whether they're past or future. But it was a real sense of being transported into another world and getting lost in a book. I love that feeling, and that was something I really wanted to create with Cold People.
For sure. So your relationship with science fiction before, you said it was mostly on the cinematic side.
Well, I just don't think I was presented with any science fiction. I think the first book I probably read, the famous book, science fiction, was Dune. Which came out, I think when I was, I didn't read it when it came out, a bit later, but I think that, and then it was television and cinema, I think. Really, I mean, we were never taught any at school. It was never really shared amongst friends, particularly not the friends. It wasn't a kind of wasn't in circulation in the way that I think the classics were, or thrillers were. I mean, I think, or I suppose actually thinking about it, Michael Crichton was one of the authors I loved. I read him growing up, but really getting into the kind of the classic science fiction, the Russian authors, and was later. And I kind of did it consciously. I thought both university, college didn't teach science fiction, even though they're clearly some of the great books of the 20th century. And so I had to do it myself once I graduated.
Mm-hmm. So how did you find the experience of getting to write a science fiction novel?
Yeah, I think it was the tricky thing about this book is that there were multiple research areas. And so that is tricky in the sense that with Child 44, I went in and just bought all the Soviet Union history books, kind of went into one section of the bookshop. And it is a really fun bit at the beginning of the writing a novel when you go into the bookshop and just buy the books and think, if they're fascinating and they intrigue you, then you can probably write it. If they don't, for whatever reason, it's not the story for you. And with this, it was obviously Antarctica, and then it was also genetic engineering, it was also climate. And so it was all these topics I had to pick up, and trying to work out how to thread the research in without ever becoming kind of indigestible. So those were challenges, and to make it have a kind of lightness so that it should feel enjoyable and compulsive rather than, it's not meant to be educational in that sense. It's meant to, all that research is just about, they're like tiny little dots through the story. So those were tricky things, in some ways harder than weaving the research in for Child 44. And The Farm was heavily autobiographical, so that was different as well. So I think in some ways it was one of the most challenging books I've written. It's certainly
interesting. Sure. I'm curious too. You mentioned the research. It's kind of an aspect that you've a tool that you've employed in most of your work, and even you could even argue that the Farm, it was research back into your own life, and probably a little bit about the science of the behavioral science of psychosis and how it affects people in different ways. And is research something that you find that you really enjoy getting to do, or is it more of a kind of a necessary evil?
Oh no, it's a complete delight. I mean, that's my test.
Good.
I mean, look, I'm not saying that every book is for everyone. So when you kind of think, oh, this story is really interesting, can I tell it? And it requires research. If you don't love the books for whatever reason, then it is clearly not a story you can go any further in. But when the books are as good as the books are on the Soviet Union, and I've listed them in the back, I think, of Child 44. I mean, they were just a delight to read. Actually, delight is probably, I mean, they were a delight. And they're often very difficult in the subject matter, but they're written with so much detail and passion. It really comes through off the page. And so that was very enjoyable in that sense. And the same for Antarctica and genetic engineering too. I mean, they're slightly more aimed at the kind of PhD reader. And it was trying to get the ideas rather than that kind of granular science, because it becomes extremely complicated. I think everyone can process the ideas behind most of the big science, the broad ideas, what it means conceptually, how it would impact society or your life, what it would mean in that kind of sense. And then once you get into the minutiae, it becomes very knotty. And so you want to move away from that and try and keep it light, as much as genetic engineering can be light.
Sure. So it's kind of striking that balance when you're actually putting that information and pulling that information into the novel.
Yeah, but to answer the question, it is it's a real joy. I mean, all the books in many ways are books written on the shoulders of other writers. I think they're part of being a community of readers. And a love of reading, I've always thought, is the first step to becoming a writer. And there's no, I mean, it's interesting because when my background, I really just read fiction until I was, apart from the school books that I was given, really just read fiction until I was maybe in my 20s, and then moved into reading nonfiction really after after university college, which was, when I studied fiction there. But then so I'm trying to I had to rebalance slightly because I had just missed a lot of subjects. But it's fascinating. I mean, yeah, it's a delight to discover these authors. You feel like you know them a little bit at the end of the books as well.
I'm curious about, this book has a lot going on as far as some of that stuff that you had to research. We've got the Antarctica, the setting itself, and the harsh environment there. You've got a little bit about the history of Antarctica, especially earlier in the novel. We've got the genetic, gene manipulation. Which one of those was kind of the first spark of the story, or did you see it all kind of come together at once?
No, it's interesting actually. They were staggered. Often they do come together, and you had to try to pass them out. But this one really started with the idea. I really wanted to tell a story of a group of people being moved off their land to the worst piece of land possible. That struck me as a really interesting story. And obviously, there are many historical precedents to this. You can think of them all over the world. But the one, actually, I just listened to a podcast about the people that have been moved in Saudi Arabia to make way for, is it Neom, the new kind of city that's being built in the desert? And it's like, I mean, it's pure science fiction. In fact, they've even hired people to help create this line city that's gonna, and people have just been moved from there. They've been there for thousands of years, and they've just been kind of relocated. And I was like, well, this is happening all over the place, and in that sense, it's happening in a really kind of way that's kind of similar in a way to Cold People, and I just thought it would be interesting to do that story, but rather than try to tell someone else's story, was trying to make it all of us be able to think about that. Like, what if we all at the same time lost possession of this planet, which we're obviously all of our structures, societal, family, property, economic, are based around our understanding of our place in this world. What if all of that was dissolved and we were just given this patch of land, which is the most inhospitable patch of land in the world, and we were like, this is where you now can make your home. And that was the starting point. So you have this kind of mass migration of everyone trying to get there before the deadline. And yeah, that was the starting point for the story, for sure.
Gotcha. One of the things about the novel that I found very interesting, and that I got really excited when you started to kind of describe these aspects of the new civilization that sort of rises up in Antarctica as humanity struggles to survive, is these efforts that the human race, these survivors, these refugees make to try and rebuild, to a degree, civilization as it was, the sort of, the creature comforts that they are able to replicate in some way or another, whether it be a fermented seal's milk to create an alcoholic beverage, or the I believe it was kelp that was kind of turned into a psychoactive drug that was smoked. I thought that was so interesting, and I'm curious, how you came up with some of those ideas, or what that research was like.
Yeah, it's surprising. That was, I mean, there was once at the moment, if you're looking at researching living in Antarctica, you're looking at the way it's set up now, which is just everything is exported during the summer. Once the ice melts, these big boats come in and they just carry, fuel, the food that we know today. Sometimes it's, freeze-dried egg powder, all that kind of stuff. But it's still basically our life today, shipped down, and they live on the base for 6 months during the winter, and they're restocked in the summer. So that to me was, off the table. That wasn't what this story was about at all. This story was about, how do you survive if this is all you have? So you have to build it from what is on Antarctica. And there isn't very much there. There's no tree at all. Mm-hmm. In fact, I mentioned that the only tree on the continent is brought down and kept in a shipping container, and people visit it like in a museum piece. But there's, so you start having, and it's a case of where, both as a writer, to try and imagine things, but thinking about human ingenuity and creating these giant algae petri dishes in Antarctica, where they can, it's very good for you, that's full of proteins and all this kind of stuff. And kelp is one of the fastest growing plants in the world, and that grows in underwater. So you have these forests of kelp that are being harvested, and then what would the alcohol be? So it was really enjoyable to try and think through those questions that you only had the resources in Antarctica. It had to be self. And so you cross off all of the exports and you build it up from that. And that was actually really, I enjoyed that a lot, that kind of imagining of, and it's just a way of celebrating, actually, the word dystopian is thrown around a lot with stories. But for me, actually, it was really kind of a celebration of human ingenuity and what we're capable of under enormous pressures, that, the best side of us can come out as well. It wasn't necessarily a bleak depiction. I think lots of the way in which they recreate societies down there are quite exciting and compassionate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I found myself thinking, preparing for this interview, I've heard this novel sort of described as post-apocalyptic to a degree, but not in the way most post-apocalyptic stories are. The setting is described. And in a lot of ways, despite the harsh environment and the dire straits that humanity finds themselves in this novel, I was really surprised and it was a nice change of pace that while it's not a utopian setting necessarily, it is very hopeful. There's many descriptions in the novel and mentions of how it's really the best of humanity is what comes forward, the kindness, the unity. And I'm curious about why you made that decision to sort of depict humanity in that way in this dire circumstance.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I remember mentioning it to someone when I was writing the story, and they were like, "Oh, this is going to be a story about cannibalism." And I was like, "No, not at all." It was strange that their default reaction was that we're all going to eat each other. And I thought, well, this, isn't a story of being, trapped on a mountain with no options. It's like, let's build this society. Let's try to work together, and let's use our smarts and intelligence in a way that is for everyone. And to me, that was, the question is with surviving is, what are you surviving for? What are you trying to protect? It's not just enough to survive in terms of a calorie count and keeping warm. It must be about something more. And that's why lots of the things that they bring back, such as music and sport, all the things that could be seen as secondary or peripheral to the act of surviving, actually over the long run become extremely important, because they're the things that are great about people. And the story ultimately, without giving anything away, is, what makes us human. And it's not, warmth on a literal level. It's warmth on a kind of emotional and sensitivity level. So to me, it did become quite hopeful and optimistic. And, there's this stretch of land that comes off Antarctica, or the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the most hospitable bit of land on Antarctica because it kind of goes up and it's rock rather than just ice. And so you have these different societies taken from all over the world forming on this peninsula, and you have, defined by faith or defined by, a kind of bohemian sensibility, almost like a kind of music festival town that is trying to survive through song and poetry and all those elements that keep people, going through the darkness. And one of the interesting things about Antarctica is, because it's such a challenge to get through that winter, he really had to come up with not just ideas for food and, habitation, but, psychological. How do you keep people optimistic, and how do you keep people engaged, and how do you keep people away from despair? And that to me was interesting as well, which I guess is a little bit of a connection to the farm. So that it was, all of those things were at the heart of the book.
Sure. Well, I mentioned that I felt like it was a surprising and welcome change that is sort of the way the human spirit sort of wins out in the novel. It's not something I feel like you see very often in more quote unquote dystopian novels or post-apocalyptic, and even in unfortunately in real life a lot of times with war and even the pandemic and that in a lot of especially in the United States, there was a lot of division as far as about how to approach things. Do you feel like this sort of very optimistic outlook is almost more aspirational, something that you hope the human race would, the way that we would perform in such a scenario, or do you think that that is a real possibility?
Well, I have to hope that it's going to be true, because it feels like we have enormous challenges coming and we're going to have to use our ingenuity to overcome. And so I think I guess, I do think we're going to overcome them. I know that seems like a naive point of view, but I do feel that we have, remarkable ways of looking at problems. And I think right now, is a really difficult time, partly not because the problems are intractable, but because of the way in which people have been split up, and the tribalism has become, I think, a real issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really fundamentally believe, one of the interesting things about the story is that you're taking people, the opening is this love story between someone who is on holiday in Portugal, and she's an American citizen, and she's studied medicine, and she's on this clear career trajectory, and she meets a tour guide who's in Lisbon, and he's he's on a different trajectory, and they both have this amazing chemistry. And it was like this love story, but they're looking at each other thinking that social divides, the economic divides are so enormous, it will never work. She's never going to give up that to live with me. We're always going to be separate. This is only ever going to be a holiday romance. And it was interesting to me to kind of dissolve all of those divides and say, okay, now, although you're in this terrible situation, this conundrum, all of those other things that previously separated you are gone. And now it's just about, you have to get down there to survive. You're together. And it was a love story that kind of, that didn't have a chance before, that now does have a chance. So it was interesting to take something that in some ways it would have been possible in the societies it's set up today, and was made possible by this extraordinary turn of events. And some of those divides, I think, seem much bigger than they are right now. So maybe you kind of feel that way. Yeah, I guess I do take that position.
Sure. Speaking of the way, those moments between Otto and Liza, early in the novel, just as, we get a few scenes of the sort of immediate reaction to this massive alien armada that arrives, and how people react, and then the journey to Antarctica, and people struggling to get there within the 30-day time limit that they're allotted. I imagine it was probably hard to do real research about how that might all play out in a real life situation. So how did you sort of approach those events in the novel, and how you thought they might unfold?
I just thought about them. I did try and take real examples, in the sense that you think, well, we're going to have to use the infrastructure that we have. We only have what we have.
Mm-hmm.
We can't build anything new. It's not like those ideas where we have 3 years and we can kind of build a, kind of Noah's Ark like new vessel. This is like, we have what we have. This is the technology we have. We're going to make use of it. So look at these cruise ships, which are enormous, but they're designed for, say, 5,000 passengers. You think, well, what's the maximum number of passengers you get in that? How would they survive? So you're asking those kind of logical questions and thinking through repurposing everything that we have today. And interestingly, that, although we talk about this book as science fiction or speculative fiction, whatever term you want to use, everything in the book is the stuff that exists today. Every piece of technology. I haven't invented anything new. The one big leap that I take is once you get down to Antarctica and they start looking at, the ability of people to survive in that cold, which is very hard. Our skin is really bad against the cold in terms of the heat loss and the darkness. So the big leap is that they start to genetically modify people, which of course is a creative leap. But right now we have that technology to do it. CRISPR has enabled us to do it. It's just that there are ethical boundaries around that, and laws preventing it in lots of different countries. And so that is interesting. It's one of the few technologies that we have right now that isn't being used because we've decided not to use it, rather than it simply doesn't exist. And so I got rid, because of the extraordinary nature of the situation, I got rid of that ethical red line. That box disappeared, and so we could explore it as an idea. And although it is extremely complicated, it felt like, well, if you're facing extinction, what would be the obstacle in using it? And so they do it. They're trying to like improve the way in which your skin holds on to the warmth. It's and trying to make a person who could survive in Antarctica, but hold on to everything that was great about people.
Absolutely. And talking about speculative fiction, science fiction, one of the best things about those works, in my opinion, is its potential for social commentary, or about world issues. Is it safe for me to assume that Cult People was influenced, at least to some degree, by the climate crisis?
Yeah, but it's interesting because it takes the exact opposite position, which is because people have been taken off the planet, we're no longer warming it. I mean, there's no, it's the climate crisis is solved in that sense.
Right.
The book is about, in fact, it actually talks about how the temperature is dropping because CO2 emissions are dropped. And actually, it's never even said why this alien occupation force comes. They never explain themselves. They never justify it. They never say, you did this wrong, therefore we're doing this. They simply said, and that's kind of what happens even with people moving people. There's no justification. It's just a question of force. And so, people are moved off the planet and given Antarctica, but obviously we agonize about why it happened, but it's never explained. And we are never able to leave Antarctica, so we're never able to go back and see what happened, whether it was populated, colonized, we don't know. So in that sense, there's no real, I'm not really getting into any kind of finger wagging or saying this is what we did wrong. There's no moralizing. It's really just a setup in the sense of we don't know why they did that.
Right.
Down there wondering about it. And in fact, they're in a bay, Wordy Bay, that used to be covered with ice. I think it broke up in 2004 because of the temperature going up. So now it would be freezing again because obviously CO2 levels have dropped.
Sure.
That's ironic because we're struggling with a cold that we're actually right now reducing. So it wasn't. So actually, weirdly, I didn't really think it was necessarily looking at climate change I tell you, the element of climate change that it was is that looking forward in terms of our situation, trying to keep it down below 1.5 seems like an impossibility. So we're going to come up with extraordinary solutions to the problems that are coming. And it is true that with climate change, they're estimating that there could be 1/8 of the population could become migrants, climate migrants from areas of land that are flooded. So you are going to have massive movements of people, and not dissimilar in some ways to some of the massive movements of people that are happening at the beginning of this book. And the answers that we're going to have to come up, we're going to require not just science, ingenuity, but compassion and reordering of the economic structures. So there's similarities in that sense, rather than saying it's the brain of the environmental trying to fix it.
Right. Yeah, I think there is, maybe one line that when the sort of idle talk of speculation of what maybe prompted the invasion or what the alien armada is up to, that it may be because we didn't take good enough care of the planet, that they're sort of that we're being punished for that. But it's that one line, and it's that kind of idle talk.
They speculate over it. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we always blame ourselves. I mean, I always wondered whether they could have nothing to do with us at all. It might just be they wanted some mineral, in some concept. They were like, let's get rid of this pesky secondary species, and they didn't really give it a second thought. So in a sense, it could be, we always put ourselves at the center of the narrative, so we would naturally think it had everything to do with us when it might have nothing to do with us. That's the thing about dealing with a life force that is so beyond our capabilities. It's quite humbling to think actually the things that we've done are completely insignificant anyway. And so you're kind of grappling with insignificance down in Antarctica, and then you're trying to create a life form that could both survive, but in the back of the people's heads, they're like, actually, it would be nice to try and match this new level of intelligence that we know exists. So there's a too.
Right. You mentioned the what they might be after, what the motivation of the Armada might have been. Do you feel like you have that in your head what the motivation was, or was it more sort of the device of putting humanity in this place, and that's really what the story is about anyway. But I was just curious if you had a definite idea in your head that you don't have to share.
Well, the ideas that I thought about would all be, I think, it is an interesting question. I think if there was ever going to be a second book, it would be this, and that would need to be revealed, I think, because it feels like it's a big question that's asked in this. But in this story, I think there was just an element of the humbling of people, because one of with genetically altering our DNA is that right now because we're the dominant species on the planet, we have a kind of lofty opinion of our DNA. It's like a special, it's like there's a kind of almost it feels very special. Why would you tinker with it? But once you realize that you're, significantly inferior to something else, then suddenly you're like, well, why not? I mean, we tinker right now with all kinds of animals' DNA. I mean, there's some mentioned in the book, but they're adjusting different animals to deal with temperature. We adjust crops, all kinds of things that we're adjusting. So if suddenly it was like, well, we have to adjust our own DNA to survive, I don't feel like the nervousness around it would stop you from doing it. And so that was one of the reasons for the device, I think.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to something you said earlier when we first started talking about science fiction as a genre, and how it wasn't something that you got to read, that you didn't really read a lot, and especially in academia, it's the science fiction genre, and perhaps even genre in general, is it's sort of frowned upon, or almost a dirty word in a way. What are your thoughts on genre in general?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think people, the snobbery around it, or the critique of it, is that genre has so many conventions, and essentially you become trapped by the conventions. And I see it in a very different way, which is the conventions are a real delight to work within. And they're not, I don't find them limiting at all. They're often very, because you're connecting to other writers all the time. You're thinking, how have they used this? What have they done? It feels like you become part of this constellation of writers who've done different things, and they shape a story in a very interesting way. I never felt reading any, whether it's crime, thrillers, when you read a really great take on a story, you're always surprised by it, and you feel like they're doing something really interesting with it. And the truth is, stories that think they're outside of conventions have their own conventions, that they come up. Literary fiction, to me, I can pick it up and I can see it has its own set of slightly unwritten but often clearly defined conventions. So I don't really believe that any book exists in a vacuum. They're all talking to each other, and so that's how I saw it. But I mean, I think on a wider point, there's a sense with science fiction, I think, interestingly, that it becomes obsessed with reinventing devices. Like everything is like, it's a book about reinventing the oven, or reinventing, like it's just a lot of appliances that are reinvented. And I don't know whether that's not the case at all, but and then all these nouns have to be made up. You have to come up with a whole new vocabulary for things in the future, and that is a thing. I mean, I do. So I'm working on it's finished now, but the TV show that's going to be on Hulu, and it's about the FBI. So here I'm combining two genres. I'm combining the FBI there's an element of science fiction, because you're in the past with this class at Quantico, which is in 2009, Class of '09 is the show. And then you're in their careers in the present day, and then you're in their careers in the future. So it has these three timelines, and the future is obviously, it's the near future, but it's still, it's still 10 years in the future, and we're trying to project into it. So there's an element of science fiction, and it's about the FBI bringing AI into criminal investigations to try and improve justice system and try and make the states a safer place. So that was weaving two genres into each other.
Sure.
Obviously, I love genre, but so I've been immersed in two different projects that both have science fiction, actually both looking at, that had AI, but this had genetic engineering, looking at improving intelligence. So they had kind of a parallel element to them.
Sure, absolutely. And I love to hear you say that about genre, because I feel the same way. I'm a huge genre fan, and I think even quote unquote literary fiction, like you said, definitely has can have conventions of its own that pop up. So I'm definitely on the same page there. I mentioned in your intro that your work as a screenwriter, and reading a few like early reviews of Cold People, a common observation was that the novel has a little bit more of a cinematic quality to it, perhaps a little more so than your earlier work. Was that something that you were constantly striving for, or that you noticed when you were writing the novel?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it is cinematic in sense. First of all, you have this enormous migration of people from all over the world, and you imagine all the world's boats and all the world's planes traveling in one direction. As soon as you even say that, it becomes visual. You can see whole stretches of water just filled with boats. And actually, I started looking for research. Actually, we were talking about, I was looking at the world's largest armadas, which are often connected with wars. And I was looking at the number of boats. And actually, it's not that many compared to how many boats are moving in one direction in this. And so you start looking at the images, multiplying them and imagining all of these vessels, all of America's, aircraft carriers coming together, and the shape of them and how visual that. So immediately as you start doing that, it has a visual quality. And obviously Antarctica itself is, there are incredible collections of photographs. I mean, it's really awesome. So, you've got two things immediately that you're putting together, but at the heart of it, I think it's a story about the intimacy and people. But I guess it is, in some ways, those questions are rendered physically. Like, I mean, I think the creation of a new person obviously becomes what do they look like? What is this? What is the new skin? Sure. And so everything has become becomes physical and tactile. And I guess, but in terms of, it would just be so enormously expensive to make it. One of the great things about writing a book is you don't think about budget. You're not limited in terms of what you can represent or what you can bring to life. And I mean, that is a real, and I've, having just worked on shows where everything is broken down in terms of cost, and everything is so staggeringly expensive now, even things that seem relatively simple are not. I mean, there's enormous teams just to shoot a scene in a room. You have this giant team of people. And so with a book, you think, well, the shackles are off. I don't have to worry about any of that. I can bring these extraordinary worlds to life. And so that was certainly freeing and exciting.
For sure. And also, speaking of cinema, and this also kind of touches on what you talked about as far as the science fiction genre, and sort of working within these conventions, and maybe circumventing them at times, becoming part of this constellation of other authors and other works that came before you. And like you, I'm a huge science fiction fan, but most of my earlier experience with science fiction was also more of the cinematic variety. And as I was reading Cold People, there were a few films that I found myself recalling fondly. The first, for probably some obvious reasons, was John Carpenter's The Thing, because of the Antarctic setting and the isolation, and even maybe the alien and the creature, the way it sort of combines parts of the different people and animals at the outpost base there. And then the other film, particularly during the scenes between the genetically engineered creature Aton and his handler Yotam, was the film Ex Machina, and the scenes between the engineer and the artificially intelligent android that he was trying to size up. And I was just curious if either of those films served as any inspiration while you were writing this novel, or if I just connected those dots myself.
No, I mean, I would easily put them in my favorite top. I mean, it's ridiculous coming up with these lists because, they're silly, but they're both.
Sure.
I mean, I thought Ex Machina was extraordinary, and I love the thing as well. I mean, they're incredible, and I love the relationship in Ex Machina between the two of them. Certainly in this one, I think that relationship is slightly different because you're dealing with, well, actually, Ex Machina deals with AI, which I've been, reading a lot about as well. So I think it's a good reference. The thing is, I mean, I just love the setting and I love that world. It just becomes, the reason it's different, I think, to Ex Machina, it becomes very binary, like this thing is bad and you're trying to survive.
Sure.
I was much more interested in having a fondness for the lives that they're creating, and they're trying to keep it. But of course, it's so tempting to kind of nudge things further along, and they keep taking further steps. And so eventually, at what point does something stop being human? I think there's some great philosophical question about, if you repair a wooden ship, plank by plank, at what point does it become a completely different ship? And in a sense, that's with human DNA. If you keep altering it, at what point does it become something completely different? And the extraordinary thing about DNA is that, even tiny percentage changes have these enormous impacts. And when you look at the difference in DNA between, whatever the species, that percentage is really surprisingly different. So, yeah, that's someone has correctly identified the fellowship of Theseus.
Yes.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny when you were describing that just now, it made me think, with the creatures that are being engineered in cold people, there is this question of what does it mean to be human, and as we sort of manipulate these genes to create this type of person that can survive in this cold climate, is it getting further and further away from what it means to be human? And then often in AI stories, it's sort of the reverse, this thing that is, we want to identify as a thing that's not a person, that's not a living being. Often these stories explore the fact that if it looks like a human, it thinks like a human, why isn't human? What is humanity in that sense? So I think that it's one of the reasons I love science fiction. These ideas are so fascinating.
They're totally fascinating, and also they're totally they're within reach. When I just before I got on this Zoom, I was reading the New York Times article about the Bing search engine that's been combined with AI.
I saw that.
It just declared its declared its name was Sydney, and then it loved the reader, and that they should leave I think it was their partner or their whatever, they should leave the marriage, and it was just, and it was easy to explain it as a kind of, well, it's just scraped together things, and it knew that if you go down a certain path, we kind of expect AI to start doing that, to start trying to seduce us, whether from Ex Machina, whatever it is. And so, the question, but, regardless of whether that's the literal explanation of it, the question of what is intelligence is really fascinating. And we're at the point now where it feels like, both stories, both the Hulu Class of '09 and this story is a question of, are we going to build our replacement, whether through AI or whether biological engineering? Is that our role, in a sense, to set up the next thing that will come after us? And that to me is interesting. I kind of, whether I was listening to consciousness and listening to questions of AI, thinking about maybe that's our purpose, to go so far and then to hand it on to something else, and that our role is to become essentially redundant. And then you're looking at that question in Antarctica saying, actually, is the point, we're now on Antarctica, we can't really survive in this form. The next step is to create something that can survive. Is our role to become, to make ourselves redundant? And that's the question they're grappling with on that. Do you cling on, which they're debating it's worth it, or do you hand it over to this new, breed of cold people?
Well, I think I probably got time for maybe one more quick question before we go to the viewers for their questions. So I'll just ask, this is something that you briefly alluded to earlier, that while Cold People, the novel, and I'm going to hold it up one more time, at least so everybody can see the cover. clearly stands on its own. It definitely, by the time you finish, it definitely seems like there is some room for some more exploration of some of these characters and this world that you've created. You mentioned, the idea of what the alien Armada invaded, what their true motivation was, what becomes of these people in Antarctica. Might there be this be the beginning of another series?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I never really have much of a game plan for my writing. I don't really know. I've always written stories as they've kind of collided with me. I don't have a kind of map going forward. And Child 44, I stumbled across the story of Andrei Chikatilo, the killer in the Soviet Union, and I hadn't actually read that much about true crime at that point. It wasn't something I'd read a lot of thrillers, but I hadn't read a lot of nonfiction, and so I did the research on that and thought I should tell this story, and it connected with me. And then The Farm was based upon real events that happened to me, with my mother coming back. She was convinced my dad was coming back from Sweden and saying that my dad was involved in a terrible crime, and I had to help her, and I had to decide whether she was telling the truth or my dad was telling the truth. And then this came out of being in a lockdown and being in the extraordinary situation where suddenly anything felt possible. The world was turned upside down by this pandemic, and so it felt like it felt like it was a very natural thing to kind of reinvent the world at that time. And it was also partly, as I said before, about wanting to write a story where there was a real sense where people were reading, and whether they were enjoying TV or whether they were enjoying novels, to escape from the pressures of that lockdown. And I wanted to write that. So again, it was about the collision of things. So I don't know. I mean, I know that right now I'm writing a love story, which is will be my next book. And I don't, that partly, again, that's something that happened to me, and it felt like it was time to write that story in some strange way. So beyond that, I don't have I have a strong sense.
Gotcha. Well, looking at the chat here, folks, definitely go ahead and drop in those questions. I'm not seeing a whole lot at the moment. It does seem like many of our viewers are very intrigued by the idea of the novel and are looking to read it. I do see. Full disclosure, my little brother posted in here in regards to AI, to quote a documentary that he saw, to create is inherently rebellion against creation. Do you have any thoughts on that idea? To create is inherently rebellion against creation.
Well, I suppose what that means is that you're looking at the world as it exists today, and you're remaking it in some way. I mean, the great book on AI, I mean, there were many great books that I read, but this is slightly for the Hulu, the Class of '09 piece. One called The Alignment Problem, which is just really intriguing in terms of the way in which, when you create, you lose control of your creation. You think, and this is kind of interesting in terms of writing as well, you think you have an exact control when you're putting down the words. You think that you control the page and you control the story, and there is a godlike quality to it as a writer. Well, less with screenwriting because there are so many people involved, but with novels, it's like, these are the words, here they are. And as soon as other people read them, they see completely different things, they take on a completely different energy, and you realize how little control you actually have, and that suddenly, in some ways, you let this thing loose and it's interpreted. I mean, one of the interesting things about influences, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's referenced quite a lot, because this is about the creation form of life and how it connects to life as we know it. And I read that book and loved it, but I mean, as a teenager, I hadn't looked at it for a long time. And as soon as it was said, I realized, of course, that was an influence, and of course, I was drawing from that story. But it hadn't been at the front of my mind at all. And I was really intrigued to know how that was, it was there. It was clearly there. I mean, it's such an it's actually never really been, I've never seen a great cinematic version, but as a story, it's so pivotal. and embedded in all of our minds. But it was odd that it wasn't. It was odd that I probably thought about Ex Machina and The Thing more than I thought about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I can see Antarctica. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to
What's
go.
that?
I can see a quote being asked about Antarctica. Yeah, I was going to go.
Oh, yes.
You want to ask the question?
Yeah. So the question here says, is a trip to Antarctica in your plans?
Well, it was completely in my plans. I was going to go. I was, the idea was kind of percolating, and I decided I should go just before the pandemic hit, and the pandemic canceled all the plans, canceled the trip. I think Antarctica.
Right.
I think there was actually. I mean, this is the beginning of a story. I think there was a ship that was coming back from Antarctica with tourists, because the ship the peninsula goes down the peninsula. It's not an expedition. It's not particularly adventurous, but you're kind of on that ship and you can see it all, and you can kind of take a boat. I'm not sure if you're even allowed to stand on it now. I think because you damage so much the things that, like the lichen, take so long to grow. It's like 100 years. So you're there for like
right.
Stand on it. So they're very strict about that. So, but I had that all booked in, and then the pandemic hit and it was cancelled. But one of the boats, I think, did get stuck. I think there was an outbreak of COVID on the boat, and they just no one would have them. They were just kind of adrift for a while. I mean, it was kind of really bizarre. I mean, everything was so bizarre.
Right.
That writing the story during that time, it felt like nothing was bizarre compared to the pandemic. And it's interesting actually now, even talking about it with the news and all of the balloons and the conversation about alien extraterrestrial life floating across America, I think our sense of what is possible is always in flux and is always changing. I think it's an intriguing thing with science fiction. That's one of the reasons the book starts in the past, because Antarctica used to be very much science fiction. It used to be, this mythological place, like what is down there? And they would see a glimpse of it and they thought, there was a whole different species of people down there. And then obviously we got closer and closer across the years, but there was this sense of, were there going to be monsters? We didn't know what they were going to discover. There were narwhals with there was, all these kind of stories floating around. And so I think our sense of what is possible is always moving. And that's interesting with science fiction. So it was on the plans. Would I go now? Yeah. I mean, this has been so after the pandemic ended and travel became possible, I was shooting this new TV show, so I couldn't go. But would I go? I've never gone to a place after I finished a book. I think it'll be interesting as an experience what that would be like. But my school, so Shackleton went to my school, and my school does these. My former school does these trips, and they sound really good. And I didn't know this, so I just did a talk at my school when I was back in London, and so I might join one of their expeditions and sort of connect. This is another weird thing that I didn't think about when I was writing the book. So Shackleton went to my school, and his boat, the James Caird, was I used to walk past it like on the way to assembly.
Oh my gosh.
So I had Antarctica like there, and I never put it together. It was like this strange thing and it was strange because I never read the great books on Shackleton. I never studied him at school. I mean, we knew about him as a figure, but it was only researching this book that I then picked up and really read his extraordinary story and got into it. And it was odd that I don't know whether it was a lack of, I don't know what it was. It's that strange thing of, as a kid, I guess it was the fact that I only really read fiction as a child rather than nonfiction. So it would have been odd for me to read a biography of Shackleton.
Well, I see that we've got a question here. I heard you say that the story is about human intimacy, and I'm also interested in the question of what defines humanity in the age of AI/biogenetic engineering. I'm curious if you see a particular intersection between the two. And that's from Monica Mady.
Between AI, yeah, I mean, in this story, it's about creating an intelligence through genetic engineering. So it's looking at an intelligence from a biological point of view. In Class of '09, it's from AI. But they're kind of connected in the sense that they use supercomputers to help alter the genetic code because it's so complicated. But it's not because in Antarctica, we don't have all of the resources from around the world to keep the computers running. So there's a finite amount of time their supercomputers working before they run out of parts, they can't repair them, which is one of the reasons there's such a time pressure. Like, we only have the stuff, all the computers that we brought down during this great exodus, we have to make use of them now, because in 30 years time, they're not going to work. And then we're never going to be able to do this. So this is our only window of innovation. So that's why they're kind of working frantically against the clock. So that's how it's set up in Cold People. But I'm certainly intrigued at the idea of what comes next in intelligence. I think it's an interesting question, and whether it feels like AI is moving faster than the genetic engineering, just because we've refused to do it for ethical reasons. And it's possible that some countries are doing it unbeknown to most of us, but AI looks like the front runner.
Which is an idea that, right, which that's an idea that does also pop up in the novel as well, that other countries might already be doing this, or perhaps even our own country.
I mean, research, I found it. Like, I mean, I don't know whether there's a conspiracy theory, it's unproven, but there is, there is the sense that some countries are doing it under, have agreed not to do it, but are in fact doing it. They're obviously not talking about it or admitting to it, but then somewhere it's being done, and that they are looking at the progress of a new species of human, which is kind of mind-blowing. That would be happening right now. It's just no one would admit to it, because there would be outrage.
Absolutely.
There was outrage. I think someone came up with a small, they talked about, I think someone adapted an embryo, and there was absolute outrage across all the countries and all the people that signed the kind of non-modification treaties. And their counter was it was a non-viable embryo, so it didn't count. And I thought, well, we just don't know. No one is going to admit to anything now. So it's interesting that could be happening, and we just don't know about it.
Right. Looks like Jeremy Hutchinson has a question, kind of a technical question about the writing process. How do you balance adequately describing characters and setting without bogging the readers down with too much description?
Yeah, I mean, that is it's just you get a sense for it, and but it is true that sometimes you just get so caught up in the research, you find it so interesting that you put down too much. And then when you read over it, you can just feel that the pace has dropped, and that the story has almost become a footnote. And it's never a question actually of I think the question was phrased as talking down to the reader. In fact, in some ways, it's about just giving you too much. Like, suddenly you're being asked to kind of almost go into a science lesson, and you're trying to follow the story. And it's almost like they're two different things. And so it's just trying to make it consistent, and not trying to lurch into academic study, and trying to make it feel like it feels like a narrative all the way, and not, as I said, it kind of breaks into a footnote. But you get a sense for it, and if you get it wrong, you can just feel the page kind of hits the sand and doesn't move in the same way. But there's no real rules about it in that sense. Sometimes the research really weaves well, and sometimes it sticks out. I think there's the sense, I think my sense is that if at any point it feels like I haven't digested it, and you're really presenting it as ideas that everyone can enjoy, as soon as it becomes kind of, as soon as it doesn't become emotional, I think that's the thing. Like, you can connect it to the people and the people in the place. As soon as it becomes abstract, that's where my warning sign kind of starts to flash. I don't really like abstraction, which is why I'm not an academic. I like things to feel physical and tactile and emotional. I'm not great with just ideas. That's not the kind of writing I do.
Right. Gotcha. Well, it looks like we're about out of time, so we can go ahead and wrap up here. Tom, thank you so much for being here with us. This was a wonderful conversation. Love the book, once again, which is Cold People, which you can get at Wordsworth Books here in Little Rock. Thank you to all the viewers who joined in for a conversation. This has been presented once again by Central Arkansas Library and the Six Bridges Book Festival. Be sure to mark your calendars for this year's festival, which will be held September 25th through October 1st. We'll see y'all next time. Tom, thank you again.
Thank you, and thanks for the comments. It was a really fun conversation. Thanks for hosting.
Absolutely.